What happens when one power-hungry HOA Karen decides that front yard vegetable gardens are an eyesore and bans them entirely? In this story, Karen launches a full-scale war against one neighbor's thriving garden in Willow Creek Estates, claiming it ruins the neighborhood's aesthetic. But when the community fights back with outrageous gardens, hidden secrets, and one explosive HOA showdown, Karen learns the hard way that she can't control what's meant to grow. Stick around to see how one simple garden sprouts into a rebellion that changes the entire neighborhood and leads to Karen's ultimate downfall. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below if you've ever dealt with an over-the-top HOA. Your support helps us bring more wild stories to life. In Willow Creek Estates, everything was neat, orderly, and meticulously maintained, just the way the HOA liked it. Rows of identical houses with manicured lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and not a single blade of grass out of place. But for Alex Thompson, that uniformity felt sterile. He wanted something more vibrant, something alive. So instead of the standard patch of green grass, Alex decided to plant a front yard vegetable garden. It wasn't just any garden. It was a thriving oasis of life, bright red tomatoes dangling from thick vines, bell peppers in vibrant shades of yellow, orange, and green, leafy kale standing tall, and fragrant herbs like basil, rosemary, and mint spilling from decorative planters. Bees buzzed lazily from flower to flower, and butterflies floated gracefully through the air. His garden wasn't just beautiful, it was functional, sustainable, and a conversation starter for neighbors passing by. Most people loved it. Neighbors would stop to admire the colorful produce, and kids from down the street would giggle as they peeked over the small white fence, pointing at the towering sunflowers Alex planted for fun. Some even swapped veggies or herbs, building a sense of community that was rare in such a pristine, rule-bound neighborhood. But there was one person who didn't see beauty in Alex's garden. Her name was Karen. Karen had recently been elected as the new HOA president of Willow Creek Estates, a title she wielded like a badge of honor. She wasn't just passionate about the rules, she was the rules. In her mind, front yards were for perfectly green grass, generic shrubs, and the occasional HOA-approved flower bed. No exceptions. In Alex's garden, a blatant act of rebellion. One morning, as Alex watered his tomatoes, he noticed a bright orange slip of paper fluttering on his front door. He pulled it off, his brow furrowing as he read, "Notice of HOA violation. Your property is in violation of Willow Creek Estates landscaping guidelines. Unauthorized vegetation, non-ornamental plants, must be removed within 14 days to maintain neighborhood uniformity. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $100. Karen, HOA president." Alex stared at the notice, then glanced back at his garden. The tomatoes glistened in the morning sun, the basil leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and a butterfly landed gracefully on a sunflower. Unsightly? Really? Determined to get some answers, Alex attended the next HOA meeting, held in the neighborhood's sterile beige community center. The room buzzed with polite small talk until Karen entered, clipboard in hand, her sharp heels clicking against the tile like a metronome of authority. When Alex raised his hand to speak, Karen barely glanced up. "Yes," she said curtly, as if she were indulging a child. "I received a violation notice about my garden," Alex began. "Can you explain what's wrong with it?" Karen flipped through her clipboard with theatrical annoyance. "Your garden contains non-ornamental plants, vegetables, herbs, and other unauthorized greenery that disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic." Alex frowned. "So I can plant roses, but not tomatoes?" Karen's thin smile didn't reach her eyes. "Correct. Willow Creek Estates maintains strict standards to preserve property values. Vegetable gardens belong in the backyard, out of sight." The room was silent. A few neighbors exchanged awkward glances, but no one spoke up. "What about sustainability? Community?" Alex pressed. "It's well kept, and people love it." Karen's expression hardened. "This isn't a farmer's market, Mr. Thompson. Rules are rules." Alex left the meeting with a crumpled violation notice in his pocket and a fire burning in his chest. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. But Karen had underestimated one thing: you can't control what's meant to grow. And Alex wasn't about to let his garden or his freedom be uprooted without a fight. The morning after the HOA meeting, Alex Thompson stood on his porch, sipping coffee and staring at his vibrant garden. The tomatoes glistened in the early sunlight, Bees buzzed lazily around the flowers, and the scent of fresh basil wafted through the air. This wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a symbol of defiance. But Karen wasn't going to let it slide. Later that day, Alex found another bright orange violation notice taped to his mailbox, bolder and more aggressive than the first. Final notice of noncompliance. Immediate removal of unauthorized vegetation required. Failure to comply within 7 days will result in daily fines of $100 and potential legal action. Karen, HOA president. Karen had also stepped up her enforcement. She now conducted compliance patrols, strolling through Willow Creek Estates with her clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose like a shield of superiority. She'd pause in front of Alex's house, snap photos of his garden with her phone, and scribble furious notes as if documenting evidence for a high-profile court case. But Alex wasn't alone. One afternoon, as he was pruning his tomato plants, his neighbor, Sophia Ramirez, walked over. A retired schoolteacher with a love for wildflowers, Sophia had her own run-in with Karen. "She fined me for my sunflowers," Sophia said, shaking her head. "Claimed they were too tall and didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic." Alex laughed bitterly. "She's treating flowers and vegetables like crimes. What's next? Banning bird feeders?" Sophia joked. Turns out it wasn't just them. Jake and Emily, a young couple down the street, had received violations for their small herb garden. Mr. and Mrs. Chong, an elderly couple, were fined for having potted strawberries near their front steps. Karen's war wasn't just against Alex's garden. It was against anything that didn't fit her rigid, soulless vision. That's when Alex realized something. Karen might be the president, but the neighborhood had the real power. Alex decided to fight back, not with confrontation, but with community. The next weekend, he hosted a casual garden gathering. It wasn't advertised as a protest, just neighbors getting together to talk, share gardening tips, and, of course, swap stories about Karen's ridiculous rules. Over lemonade and homegrown snacks, they formed an unspoken alliance. Phase 1. Garden expansion. Alex added more plants, colorful bell peppers, sprawling pumpkin vines, and even a trellis with climbing beans right by the sidewalk. Sophia doubled down on her wildflowers, planting bright, towering blooms that practically screamed rebellion. Jake and Emily expanded their herb garden, adding lavender, thyme, and mint in decorative pots lining their driveway. Mr. and Mrs. Chong turned their strawberry pots into an entire mini fruit patch, adding blueberries and raspberries. Karen's reaction was immediate and predictable. She ramped up her patrols, marching through the neighborhood with the intensity of someone on a personal mission. Her clipboard became an extension of her arm, her phone constantly snapping photos of violations. She even started leaving handwritten notes with passive-aggressive comments like, "Your sunflowers are offensive to neighborhood uniformity. Consider the property values you're ruining with this garden." Compliance is not optional. But instead of intimidating the neighborhood, Karen's behavior united them. Neighbors who had never spoken before were bonding over their shared frustration. Community gardens popped up in front yards where plain grass had once ruled supreme. People planted everything from colorful flowers to bold vegetable patches, turning Willow Creek Estates into a vibrant, living mosaic. Karen's war had backfired spectacularly. But she wasn't done. If garden expansion wasn't enough to break their spirit, she had a new plan, a mandatory compliance inspection, where she'd go door to door, demanding that residents remove their gardens on the spot. She had no idea what she was walking into. Karen was relentless, and her next step was drastic. She announced that she would personally be conducting mandatory compliance inspections throughout the neighborhood. The purpose? To ensure that all gardens, especially the ones unapproved by her, were removed immediately. The tension in Willow Creek Estates was palpable. Residents huddled in small groups, strategizing how they could defend their gardens without provoking Karen any further. Some of them even started calling it the garden resistance. The fight wasn't just about flowers and vegetables anymore. It was about community autonomy, individuality, and standing up to Karen's dictatorial rule. Alex wasn't worried, though. He'd seen Karen's bullying tactics before. This was just another attempt to break their collective spirit. But he had a plan. Phase 2. Creative defiance. Rather than remove his garden, Alex decided to do the opposite. He added to it. He installed a small wooden sign at the entrance of his garden, painted with bold, playful letters, "Grow where you're planted." He planted more tomatoes, peppers, and even a small fruit tree near his front porch. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was an art installation. Sophia set up a wildflower protest, creating a full flower bed that was a riot of color, with daisies, sunflowers, and lavender towering by her sidewalk. Other neighbors took similar approaches. Jake and Emily built a trellis and added climbing ivy to their herb garden, turning it into a secret garden of sorts that Karen couldn't touch. Mr. and Mrs. Chong planted an ornamental vegetable patch, decorating it with tiny solar lights and garden gnomes, making it appear harmless yet undeniably rebellious. Each new garden was an act of defiance, small but mighty. It didn't take long for Karen to show up at Alex's doorstep. Armed with her clipboard, she stood on the sidewalk, glaring at his expanded garden. "This is a violation," she stated bluntly, holding up her phone to take a photo. "I've warned you multiple times. Your garden is an eyesore." Alex remained calm, standing beside his thriving vegetable patch. "It's not an eyesore, Karen. It's a garden. A healthy, productive garden." Karen sneered. "This is your last warning, Alex. I'm issuing a fine today for noncompliance." She scribbled on her clipboard. "And if you don't remove this by next week, I'll take further action." Alex smiled. "You can keep issuing fines, Karen. But this garden stays." At that moment, the unthinkable happened. From down the street, Sophia appeared, walking confidently toward Karen. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone firm but friendly. Karen's eyes narrowed as Sophia approached, clearly feeling the pressure of being confronted. "These gardens are a violation, Sophia," Karen snapped. "The HOA voted on these rules. They must be followed." Sophia shook her head, undeterred. "No one voted for this rule, Karen. And frankly, your rules are suffocating this community. We're not going to remove our gardens. You'll have to drag us all into court if you want to stop us." Sophia's words were like a match thrown onto a pile of dry wood. The fire of rebellion had spread. One by one, neighbors began to step out of their homes, joining Sophia and Alex in front of his garden. They stood together, defiant and unwavering. Karen looked around, clearly overwhelmed. The entire street was now watching her. She turned on her heel, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief. Without saying a word, she stormed off. Alex turned to the neighbors who had gathered. "We're not backing down," he said, voice strong. "This garden isn't just about plants. It's about standing up for what's ours." The crowd cheered. The rebellion was no longer just about vegetables. It was about taking back their neighborhood from Karen's oppressive grasp. The next day, Karen issued another notice. This time, it was more aggressive. Final notice of noncompliance. Immediate removal of all non-ornamental plants is required. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in the involvement of legal action and further fines. Karen, HOA president. But the momentum had already shifted. The community wasn't scared anymore. Instead of scattering, the neighbors gathered at Alex's house to make plans. They were no longer waiting for Karen to come to them. They were taking action. The next HOA meeting was scheduled, and this time, the residents were ready to present their case, with evidence of Karen's overreach and hypocrisy. They would show Karen that no matter how hard she tried, Willow Creek Estates was theirs to shape, not hers. The stage was set for a showdown. The community of Willow Creek Estates had never been so united, not by a shared love of gardening, but by a shared frustration with Karen's heavy-handed control. At the next HOA meeting, Alex arrived early, his mind racing with plans. He was ready to challenge Karen's rule head-on, backed by neighbors who had grown tired of her overreaching policies. The community center was packed. As the clock ticked toward the start of the meeting, whispers of rebellion spread through the room. Residents who hadn't spoken at previous meetings now stood in solidarity, each with a story of their own about Karen's unjust fines, overbearing inspections, and endless demands for compliance. Alex was prepared to turn the tables on her once and for all. As Karen entered, clipboard in hand, the atmosphere shifted. She took her usual place at the front, scanning the room with an air of superiority. But today, she wasn't just facing complaints about her rule. She was about to be exposed. "Let's get started," Karen said, her voice as cold as ever. "I'd like to address the ongoing issue with non-compliant gardens in the neighborhood." Alex stood up, his voice clear and steady. "I'd like to address something first, Karen." Karen's eyes narrowed. "This is not your turn, Alex. We're sticking to the agenda." But Alex didn't back down. He walked to the front of the room, a packet of documents in his hand. Actually, Karen, it is. Because you've been enforcing rules you yourself are breaking. A murmur rippled through the room. Karen looked unsettled but kept her composure. What are you talking about? Alex clicked the projector on, revealing a photograph of Karen's own backyard. The photo, taken by a neighbor, clearly showed a large greenhouse with flames from a gas heater flickering inside. Karen's secret garden, much like Alex's, was right there, visible for all to see. Alex's voice grew stronger. This is your backyard, Karen. And this greenhouse violates your own rule about outdoor structures and open flames. You've been breaking your own rules while enforcing them on others. The room fell silent as the residents processed what Alex had revealed. Karen's cheeks flushed red. She fumbled with her clipboard, trying to maintain her composure. This isn't the same, Karen said, her voice shaking. That's a necessary structure for my personal use. It's different from a garden. Is it? Alex challenged. You've been calling our gardens unsightly, but what about your greenhouse? The plants inside are hardly ornamental. A few residents spoke up, their voices strong. You can't pick and choose who follows the rules. You've been fine with your own garden while punishing us. Alex turned back to the crowd, his heart pounding, but his resolve firm. Karen, we're not here to make your rules easier for you to enforce. We're here to demand that everyone, including you, abide by them. The community was on his side. One by one, neighbors began to speak up in support of Alex and the garden rebellion. They shared their frustrations about Karen's double standards, her abuse of power, and how she had imposed unnecessary restrictions on their homes for far too long. Even those who had remained quiet in previous meetings were now standing, emboldened by the support of their fellow residents. Karen, visibly flustered and defeated, tried to argue, but her words lacked conviction. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to hide it anymore. Stephanie, a calm and collected member of the HOA board, stood up. I believe it's time to vote on two key points: removing Karen as HOA president and overturning the garden ban. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. Karen's face turned even paler as she realized what was happening. She tried to speak, but no one was listening. The vote was called. All in favor of removing Karen as HOA president? Stephanie asked. The hands shot up like a tidal wave. All opposed. Stephanie continued. Not a single hand was raised. The room erupted in applause as Karen's grip on Willow Creek Estates was officially severed. The garden ban was overturned, and the neighborhood's unity was stronger than ever. The following week, the neighborhood hosted a garden freedom celebration. The front yards were filled with flowers, vegetables, and plants of all shapes and sizes. Alex's garden was the centerpiece, vibrant and flourishing, a symbol of what the community had fought for. Karen, meanwhile, had packed up her things. She had made the decision to sell her house and move on. Her attempts to control the neighborhood had backfired, and her reign was over. Willow Creek Estates was no longer the cookie-cutter, perfectly manicured neighborhood Karen had envisioned. It had transformed into something more beautiful, something real. The spirit of community had triumphed, and the residents knew they could stand together against anything. As Alex stood by his garden, watching the neighborhood celebrate, he knew one thing for sure: when you plant the seeds of rebellion, they grow into something powerful. And as for Karen, she was left with nothing but the realization that you can't control what's meant to grow. And that's how a neighborhood took a stand against an over-the-top HOA Karen who tried to control their front yard gardens. In the end, their defiance not only overturned her rule, but also brought the community closer together, proving that no one can control what's meant to grow. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below with your own HOA experiences. We love hearing from you, and your support helps us keep sharing these unbelievable tales. Thanks for watching, and remember, you can try to control the garden, but you can't stop it from blooming.